I've seen influencers talk about how black men, heterosexual black men, they say cisgender. I hate that word, first of all.
Yeah, it's crazy.
You can't, first of all, don't call a straight male cis. You know what I'm talking about? It just don't make no sense.
It's almost like, I don't know, like I'm married to a Mexican woman.
Yeah.
Most of my friends growing up were, Mexican American, and I don't know anybody who says Latinx.
Yeah, nobody gonna utilize none of those terms.
Yeah.
And so they went too far. Right? They took this playbook that doesn't represent the values of Black America whatsoever. Then you threw in intersectionality in there, right? And then we seen that wasn't real. So intersectionality is when the black women and the white women and the LGBT, right? They all group together as an oppressed group. And so you would hear all of these stats about what they're not getting. And I always be like, damn, y'all act like black men are getting all the things y'all saying y'all not. Right? Even when we talk about VC capital at less than 1% going to black people, but instead of saying that number, you talk about the less than 1% going to black women. It's like, why don't we just talk about it as a whole? Because it's not a competition of who getting less between us. We have to be a family and then saying, how do we go get more? But I look at this timeline of history right now is wrong. When a lot of people will go study African American studies, but you're still only going to get certain ancestral study, right, that gets pulled out. And then at the end of that, you have to ask yourself, if I indoctrinate you completely with African American studies, what sort of consciousness do you have? Is it a do for self? Do you feel victorious? Or do you feel oppressed? Do you feel like an assimilationist, right? Do you feel like an integrationist? When you look at American history, why wasn't Marcus Garvey and Elijah Muhammad taught as much when they had the most successful platforms ever built in American history? We hear about Black Wall Street, which was incredible, right? But we never hear about the economic network of the Nation of Islam, right? When they would do their Savior's Day meetings, they would report $50 million in earnings. And in today's time, that's half a B. Right, which would have been worth more than Black Wall Street at the time. He had an economic network all across America, but that lesson was never even taught in school, that was the last economic empire that we had, right? And it didn't fail per se. His son inherited it and his son dismantled it. So it wasn't something that was just destroyed like Black Wall Street. So it doesn't end with this tragic story of saying everything we build, they're gonna destroy. No, that's not the reality.
Yeah, like the narrative of what happened in Tulsa is like, It reads to historic history books better.
Yeah, it's a victim mindset that it possesses, and it ends with trauma. And anytime you feel like something is with trauma and you don't come from a place of victory, like, you ask somebody when they from the Bay, where you from, they gonna say Oakland.
Right.
But why they say it like that though? It's because you saying I come from a place of pride.
Right.
You feel me? Like, this is where I'm speaking from. You feel me? Like that moral pride and that pride that you have in self makes you feel like you can do anything. But a lot of times the way we feel about Black history is like, oh, we came from this place of oppression, we were slaves. And then slavery is not taught right. Right? We don't talk about the Seminole Wars and when there was free towns in Florida and there was men like John Horst that he fought in 2 wars and in multiple battles. He fought for his freedom. He fought against the Indians. He fought with the Indians.
Right.
You feel me? And then, of course, there were the Black Seminoles that had babies, the Native Americans and Africans having babies. We don't even talk about that lineage and timeline enough. That was a complete warrior class where they was fighting wars and winning. And we just don't spread that information at all. Like, we're not a warrior class of super resilient people. Because if you got that kind of pride growing up, you think of your timeline differently, right? If you come from just the Malcolm and Martin timeline, that's conflict. Is you Malcolm, is you Martin? Is it Muslim, is it Christian?
If you're surface level educated on both of them, then they're opposites. They're polar opposites.
And where do they lead? Nowhere.
Right.
Right? I'm not talking about as a whole people, because people that follow Malcolm don't actually follow him, right? They inspired by the story, but they don't follow the teachings. A cat have a whole Malcolm X tattoo, a white girl on his arm, and goddamn, you feel me, go eat some pork the next day, but he was inspired by Malcolm. Right. That's not the power. The power is what made him Malcolm X. And that would be the teachings that he learned.
Yeah, I would say too, like, it's as a young white kid who would just go to the library all the time. I remember reading the autobiography of Malcolm X back in the day and just like realizing like, oh, this fool was like a fucking player for real. Like Detroit Red was like, you know what I'm saying? Like,
Detroit like Oakland, you feel me?
Yeah.
You go grow up in it for sure.
Yeah, like just such a complex guy who I feel like somehow like, It's like you said, man. Somebody will get a whole tattoo of somebody, or wear a hoodie, or and it's like there's so much.
We make them symbols without substance.
Right.
And when they just a symbol without the meaning and understanding and the nuance in the background, like if you study the life of Malcolm, it should lead you to Elijah Muhammad's teachings. Mm-hmm. What was he studying? How did he become who he was? And then I'm putting together a think piece. It's a newsletter that I have, and it was, what is the world without Elijah Muhammad, right? And then you have to go into a whole lot of nuance. If Elijah Muhammad doesn't exist at all, the whole world changes. Hip hop changes.
For sure.
You don't get Father Allah. You don't get, the God body influence, right, in hip hop. You don't get the Rakims and the Wu-Tangs.
Yeah, you don't get RZA. You don't get, don't get Chuck D. You don't get so much stuff is.
Then a student of his was Dr. Sebi. He was the first to give us the dietary restrictions on what to eat in America.
Yeah.
So then you get a change in that. You don't see the sea moss everywhere. Right? Not saying that he directly told anybody to eat sea moss, but Dr. Sebi said this was the only black leader that I seen that was worried about black people's health, because he was an FOI at one point in time. You don't get Malcolm X, and you don't get Honorable Minister Louis Farrakhan with the Million Man March. Right? You don't get none of these things. You have to change so much about history and black consciousness. And that is just saying that when you erase figures like essentially Marcus Garvey from truly being understood, right? And you erase, Noble Drew Ali from truly being understood, and the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, and you only give us, right, as our main people that we go to in our minds, Martin and Malcolm, right? But that right there is a contradiction within itself, because even Martin Luther King, history wasn't the dream. It was who he was after that speech. Right. That's his real story. What he started talking about after that, and he was like, man, I realize we go burn in this house if we integrate. I realize it got to be economic upliftment. I realize we got to get our own, because the America that we about to integrate in is so morally bankrupt that it's going to corrupt us if we integrate within it. So it's easy and commercially viable for America to spread the dream speech, because that's easier for them to control. But the radical leaders that say do for self, we go build our own economic base. We gonna have our own airplanes and import and exports and our own banks and supermarkets and schools, and say, look, that's cool with the Montgomery bus boycott, but what about we just take our money and invest in our own buses that we already have, and then we can bus our own people instead of trying to sit in the front of the bus. That is a completely radical difference, and I think this generation is more aligned with the radical teachers that was talking about economic rights versus just civil rights.
Do you think there was a purposeful effort to make Black America dependent on the system, if you will?
100%. That's the whole
because me and James always talk about it, and he's like, if you go back and look, like the Black family was strongest prior to
100%.
The incentivizing Black men to not be in the home of their children. If you were a mom, like there were certain points in times where they'd come to your door and see if the dad was there. For you to get your welfare and all that shit. And so it's like you said, it's like if you talked about Black Wall Street. It's like why hasn't that been replicated in since then? That's 100 years ago.
That's the whole point. It has multiple times. There was multiple cities. Over 60 plus towns and cities. What happened is that story after that time, after that happened, well, we had high in belief, because you got to remember, right? You talking about a time in the late 1800s, early 1900s, right? In the 1920s, there was this belief, right, that we can do for self. Coming out of, at the 1865 Juneteenth, right, coming out of that slavery and so-called being emancipated, the belief was, all right, we go build our own thing now. Like, they was afraid because they understood that the Black working class was going to be a large consumer group and have so much power, right? And so they seen that, because it wasn't just everybody just out of rags and slavery. There was a lot of free Black people already at that time, right, that were astute, that were leaders and teachers that had written books and had philosophies, right? Like Frederick Douglass.
For sure.
So they understood, wait a minute, if we lead them up to their own devices, they just gonna build, and they did. Right? They had their own political systems. They had their own newspapers in multiple cities. It wasn't just Black Wall Street that was burnt down, but what they was really trying to do was kill the spirit to believe in doing for self. How do we stop to get y'all believing you can create your own city and infrastructure and economy? That was what it was really about. It was a terrorist event to destroy the spirit, right, of self-sovereignty in this country by black Americans. And they wanted them to spread that terror story so that you never speak from this victorious place like we can do everything ourselves.
Right.
That's when leaders that started talking about integration, right, and how do we work within the system, the Thurgood Marshalls and things of that nature became more popular because the belief was less of let's just create our own, and then it was more of how do we work with them. You get the NAACPs born out those movements. But at that time, there was always different dissenting voices against each other saying, no, I think the best way forward is we create our own. Those voices always went further. That's when you get the Marcus Garveys, right? Saying he was teaching about stock certificates and giving people equity inside, you know, his business with the Black Star Line because he looked at the White Star Line and said, why don't we just have our own? Right? Same thing we do now. That entrepreneurial spirit, that Pan-African movement, that is from Marcus Garvey. The Black Star and the Ghana flag wouldn't be black if it wasn't for him. Right? That's the Black Star Line. So that was the radical movement of us looking at it like, all right, we also had global alliances too. And this is one of the interesting things because now there's always this fight between FBAs and Africans and things. But at that time, you had a connection between the Japanese and all of the black groups because the Japanese was going against America. So they started looking at maybe they gonna be the ones to defeat white supremacy, right? We seen them complete an operation defeating the Russians and we was like, oh, we ain't never seen nobody with the white boys like that. They might be the ones. So there was a Black Dragon Society, right, that was committing assassinations and they was based on Pan-Asianism. They wanted Asia for Asians. Then they connected with the Pan-Africanists, want African for Africans, right? And so that became this connection of how do we help influence these groups in America that want to do for self, that don't like white supremacy, and we don't like it, even though they was really going for imperialism. So what happened was after they lost World War II, or I believe World War II, right, the Hiroshima bomb dropped on them, that destroyed this belief because, and this is something that we never talk about, what did that bomb do to black Americans? When they seen America drop a bomb on Hiroshima and the Japanese were starting to seem like an ally for the black community, that devastated a lot of groups who had connections with the Japanese. So you have somebody like Mattie Maud, who was from offset of Marcus Garvey, had over 300,000 members. She was getting funding from the Japanese and she was pushing pro-Japanese sentiment, right, throughout the hoods and throughout her organization. But when they lost, she lost a lot of those followers and a lot of them came to the Nation of Islam because Nation of Islam still had the same message of we gonna do for self and it's the black man that you follow. Nobody else is gonna come to save us, we gonna save ourselves, right? So then you start looking at how history shifted after that, and we start moving more towards civil rights and integrationalists. And I think it was a spiritual change. It was a fear, right, that pushed us towards that movement, right? It wasn't our radical leaders that was talking about economics. They said, man, how about we just figure out how to work with these boys? And then I believe that was also FBI and CIA that was integrating and pushing certain leaders and putting money behind certain voices to push that propaganda.